It was just another busy Saturday at Oakwood Plaza Mall in Lexington, Kentucky. The sun streamed through the large glass windows, casting soft light across the bustling walkways. Children darted between stores, their laughter echoing through the air, while parents strolled lazily behind, sipping coffee or browsing the latest sales. The familiar scent of warm pretzels and cinnamon filled the air, mingling with the sound of casual chatter and footsteps. The mall, a favorite destination for families, was alive with its usual weekend energy. Some people were in a rush to finish their shopping, while others simply enjoyed the relaxed pace of the afternoon. The usual sights and sounds were all present: teenagers hanging out near the food court, young couples walking hand in hand, and older shoppers taking their time, enjoying the simple pleasure of window shopping. It was a scene you'd expect on any given Saturday, nothing out of the ordinary. That was, until a man in a black blazer and a red MAGA hat strolled in, and everything changed. At first he blended in like any other visitor, but something about him caught the attention of the people nearby. They began whispering to one another, their curiosity piqued. Was that who they thought it was? A young boy standing near the entrance, phone in hand, quickly snapped a picture. Word began to spread, and before long the mall was abuzz with rumors. Could it be Elon Musk? The man continued walking through the plaza, unaware of the growing spectacle around him. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the rising tension among the onlookers. Whispers turned into conversations, and a sense of intrigue filled the air as the crowd's attention shifted toward this man with the MAGA hat. Was it truly Elon Musk? Or just a coincidence that the billionaire tech mogul happened to be in town? The uncertainty hung in the air like an unspoken question. The mall, once a simple backdrop to a Saturday afternoon, was about to become the center of a story that would captivate everyone who witnessed it. As the rumors swirled, the figure in the black blazer continued walking through the Oakwood Plaza Mall with quiet confidence, completely unaware of the stir he had caused. He paused at a nearby display, examining a sleek new smartwatch in the electronics store window. The crowds grew around him, their curiosity getting the better of them. Whispers turned to stares, and even some bold enough to ask, "Are you Elon Musk?" were met with a calm, but vague, smile and a slight nod of his head. But he didn't confirm or deny anything. His silence only fueled the growing intrigue. Across the mall, in the corner of the food court, a young boy named Lucas stood frozen, his phone still in his hand. His eyes were wide with disbelief. Could it really be him? He was a fan of tech news and followed Musk's every move. He'd seen his face on countless interviews and posts. But now, standing in front of him in the flesh, the man seemed both too real and too surreal. Lucas didn't hesitate. His finger tapped quickly on his phone, sending the picture he had snapped earlier to his best friend, Adam. The text that followed was simple but carried a sense of urgency. "I think I found him, Elon Musk." Meanwhile, other shoppers had also caught on. Some made subtle attempts to get closer, while others took pictures from afar, their phones raised like covert agents on a mission. The air was electric with the possibility of a celebrity encounter. But the most unexpected part of all was the fact that this man, allegedly Elon Musk, wasn't behaving like the typical celebrity. He wasn't hiding behind bodyguards or surrounded by an entourage. He was just walking through the mall like any other person. And then, out of nowhere, the moment happened. A woman named Carolyn, in her early 60s, walked up to him. She wasn't starstruck, nor was she particularly interested in tech, but she had heard the whispers. As a longtime resident of Lexington, she was used to people coming and going through the mall, but the energy around this person felt different. "Excuse me," Carolyn said softly. "Are you really Elon Musk?" Her voice was kind but inquisitive, as if she were asking about a neighbor's new dog, not about one of the richest men in the world. The man looked up from his watch, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. For a brief moment, everything else around them seemed to fade away. He smiled, a warm yet somewhat guarded smile, and simply replied, "I get that a lot." Then, he added in a tone that caught Carolyn by surprise, "But no, I'm just a guy who wants a little peace and quiet." Carolyn blinked, a bit thrown off by his unexpected response. She chuckled lightly, unsure if she was being dismissed or invited into a conversation. "It's fine," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "You can think what you like." His words were cryptic, but they felt oddly sincere, as if he was giving her permission to believe whatever she wanted. The brief exchange left Carolyn wondering, was he telling the truth? Behind them, A small crowd had gathered, and the once casual observer in the crowd who had been snapping photos earlier, Lucas, felt the weight of this strange, unexpected encounter. His text to Adam had already gone viral among their small group of friends, but now he wasn't sure what to think. Was it possible? Could this really be Elon Musk? But before anyone could ask him directly, the man turned and slowly made his way toward the escalator, his presence still lingering in the air. The crowd's uncertainty hung in the air as everyone debated quietly, trying to piece together the truth. At that moment, one thing was clear: this wasn't just an ordinary day at Oakwood Plaza Mall anymore. This was the beginning of a story no one would forget. As the man in the black blazer ascended the escalator, the murmurs in the crowd continued to swirl. People couldn't help but stare, some hoping for more interaction, while others hesitated to approach, unsure if they were even speaking to the real Elon Musk. Carolyn, still caught in the strange encounter, found herself looking back toward the man as he disappeared into the upper level of the mall. Lucas, the young boy who had snapped the first photo, felt a mixture of confusion and excitement building inside him. This is insane, he thought, barely able to keep his hands steady as he typed out another message. This time, he sent it to his entire friend group. "Guys, I think I just saw Elon Musk, but he doesn't look like he cares at all. Just chilling in the mall. Am I crazy?" Meanwhile, Carolyn, still processing the interaction, made her way toward the same escalator. Something about the man's calm demeanor, despite the frenzy he had unknowingly caused, piqued her curiosity. She was no tech expert, but she had seen his name in the news, especially with the electric company SpaceX and the high-profile ventures. Yet, the way he handled himself in person seemed completely different from the public persona she was used to seeing. He was humble, perhaps even a bit too humble for someone of his stature. Reaching the upper level of the mall, Carolyn paused, scanning the area. There was no sign of the man. She decided to take a walk around, hoping to spot him again. She wandered past stores, over to the food court, but she didn't see him. Just as she began to think that maybe it was all just a fluke, her phone buzzed with a new notification. It was a picture. A selfie from Lucas. The caption read, "I told you it's him. He's right next to the coffee shop on the second floor. Don't miss it." Carolyn's heart skipped a beat. She quickly moved towards the coffee shop, her eyes darting back and forth, scanning for any sign of the mystery man. And there, near the windows, she saw him again. The same man in the black blazer, sitting by himself, seemingly lost in thought as he stared out at the parking lot below. He didn't seem like a man who was trying to hide. If anything, he looked like he was trying to blend into the crowd. Carolyn hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked up to his table. This time, she didn't ask if he was Elon Musk. She had already learned that question only sparked more confusion. Instead, she decided to approach it from a different angle. "You know," she said as she approached, "you're causing quite the stir around here." The man glanced up at her, this time with a more open expression. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he replied with a soft laugh. "I just needed a break from the madness." "You're a long way from Silicon Valley for a break, aren't you?" Carolyn responded, sensing that the mystery was deepening. He looked at her again, his eyes narrowing slightly as if evaluating whether to say more. Then, with a faint sigh, he put down his coffee cup and leaned in a little closer. "You could say I'm not who you think I am," he said quietly, as if it were a secret only meant for her. "But at the same time, maybe I am." Carolyn's curiosity piqued. This wasn't just a celebrity dodging fans or a rich man pretending to be someone else. There was something deeper here. She could feel it. But she didn't press for more. She simply nodded and took a seat across from him, not sure what to expect. Minutes passed in comfortable silence before he spoke again. "You're the first person to sit with me without asking for an autograph or a selfie. Most people don't see beyond the public image," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. Carolyn smiled lightly. "I guess I'm more interested in who you really are, not just the image people see." A moment of understanding passed between them. Carolyn realized that this wasn't about fame or wealth. It was about the man sitting in front of her, quietly experiencing life in a way few others ever could. And for the first time since their encounter, the man finally offered a piece of clarity. "Elon Musk is just a name," he said softly, "but behind the name, there's someone else entirely." As he said those words, Carolyn realized that whatever was going on, this was only the beginning of a much larger story. What would happen next would change everything. Carolyn leaned forward, her curiosity growing with each passing second. The man's words echoed in her mind. Elon Musk is just a name, but behind the name, there's someone else entirely. She looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of a joke or trick, but there was nothing. His expression was sincere, even vulnerable. "Who are you, really?" Carolyn finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It felt like the right question, though she wasn't entirely sure why. The man paused. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, almost as though he were weighing the decision to reveal his truth to her. Carolyn held her breath. She didn't want to rush him. The silence between them felt comfortable, not awkward. There was a sense of anticipation, like something significant was about to happen. Finally, he spoke. "My name is David, but the world doesn't know me by that name." His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it, as though the name David carried a lifetime of memories. David leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of his coffee cup. "I've spent my life in the public eye, but what most people don't know is that I'm not Elon Musk the way they think I am. I've been hiding in plain sight for a long time." Carolyn's heart raced. This wasn't the conversation she expected to have when she first bumped into him. She had assumed, like everyone else, that she was speaking with Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur known for his ventures in tech, space and electric cars. But this man, David, was different. There was an air of secrecy about him that was both intriguing and unsettling. "Why would you hide?" Carolyn asked, her voice a mix of confusion and fascination. "You've built such an empire, you could have everything you already do." David smiled, but it wasn't a smile of pride. It was a sad, knowing smile, like someone who had seen the price of fame and success up close. "You think I've built an empire, but I've also built walls around myself," he said softly. "People see Elon Musk and think they know everything about me, what I want, what I believe in, what I stand for. But it's not that simple." Carolyn sat back, taking in his words. This wasn't just a man who was tired of fame. This was someone who had lived a double life, constantly torn between who the world believed him to be and who he truly was. It was as if the persona of Elon Musk had become a mask so ingrained in him that he couldn't remember the last time he took it off. "You've been living a lie?" Carolyn asked, her voice a mix of shock and sympathy. David nodded. "Not a lie in the way you think, but yes, it's complicated. I didn't ask for the attention. I didn't ask to become a symbol for something greater than myself. But when you're thrust into the spotlight, it's easy to lose track of who you are. And before you know it, you've become someone else, a version of yourself that the world created, not the version you actually are." Carolyn felt her chest tighten. There was an honesty to David's words that she hadn't expected. She had assumed that Elon Musk, the billionaire tech mogul, would be untouchable, far removed from any struggles of identity or self-worth. But now, sitting here across from him, she saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the deep yearning to reconnect with the person he once was, before the world took over. "So what now?" Carolyn asked, leaning forward again. "Are you going to stop pretending to be Elon?" David's expression softened, and for the first time, he looked more at peace than she had seen him since their conversation began. "No," he said quietly. "I can't just stop. Too many people depend on what I've built. But I'm done with hiding. From now on, I want to be honest with you and with the world." For a brief moment, Carolyn wasn't sure what to say. The weight of his words hung in the air. There was no easy resolution to this situation. How could someone with so much to lose risk everything for the sake of authenticity? But then David leaned in slightly, his voice barely a whisper, and added, "I've been trying to find a way to step out of the shadow, to live a life beyond the public image. I want to be more than just the face of my companies, the headline in the news. I want to be David again, and maybe that's what I need most right now." Carolyn sat in stunned silence. The world she thought she knew where Elon Musk was a larger-than-life figure, an icon of innovation and progress, was crumbling before her eyes. In its place was a man searching for something far more elusive, his true self. David glanced up at her and smiled faintly, this time with a hint of hope in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly, "for seeing me. For listening." Carolyn nodded, feeling the weight of his gratitude. She realized that this moment wasn't just about the revelation of a hidden truth. It was about a man finally being allowed to be himself again. And in that quiet, private moment, she understood that the story of David and the story of who Elon Musk really was far from over. The world had only seen one side of the coin. And now, the real journey was just beginning. The conversation between Carolyn and David lingered in the air long after the words were spoken. It felt as if the weight of years of hidden truth was finally being lifted. Carolyn sat back, her mind racing as she processed everything she had just learned. She had met Elon Musk, no, David, but it wasn't just the man she had imagined. This wasn't the billionaire tech mogul the world had come to know. This was someone raw, vulnerable, and searching for meaning. David broke the silence, his voice steady but soft. I know this is a lot to take in, but I needed to tell someone. I've kept this secret for so long, it feels like I'm finally able to breathe again. Carolyn nodded, understanding the weight of his words. It wasn't just about fame or fortune, it was about reclaiming one's sense of self. For someone like David, who had been swallowed by the expectations of the world, this revelation was a step toward freedom. I can't imagine what it's been like for you, Carolyn said, her voice filled with empathy. Living under the pressure of being someone everyone thinks they know, but no one really does. David smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in it. It's exhausting. You're constantly pretending to be someone you're not, trying to meet everyone's expectations. But at some point, you start to lose track of who you are beneath it all. He looked out the window, his gaze distant. Carolyn followed his eyes, watching as the city passed by, unaware of the conversation taking place inside the cafe. The world outside seemed so far removed from the intimate truth that David had just shared. Is it possible to break free from all of this? Carolyn asked, her curiosity piqued. Can you just walk away from everything and be David again? David turned back to her, his eyes thoughtful. I don't think I can walk away completely. Too many people rely on the work I've started. But I'm learning to be more honest with myself, to step away from the persona and connect with what's real. Maybe that's the first step. Carolyn leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. And what do you really want, David? If you could have anything, if you could rebuild your life, how would you do it? David hesitated, his mind clearly weighing the enormity of her question. After a long pause, he answered with a quiet resolve. I want to reconnect with the people I've lost touch with. I want to create again without the pressure of being someone's hero or savior. I want to know that I'm doing something for the right reasons, not just for fame or money. He sighed, his shoulders relaxing as he finally allowed himself to dream, to think beyond the constraints of his public identity. I want to help people, Carolyn, but not in the way the world expects. I want to use my resources to make a real difference, to change lives, not just to make headlines. Carolyn's heart swelled with admiration. This wasn't the Elon Musk everyone knew. This wasn't the man who made headlines for his technological feats or space explorations. This was a man who had a deep desire to give back, to truly make a difference on a human level. But how do you do that? Carolyn asked, her voice full of hope. How do you start over when you've built so much already? David paused, his eyes thoughtful. I think it starts with small acts. It's about showing up for the people who need it, not just the people who can help you build your empire. It's about listening, really listening, and making decisions that aren't just about money or power. I want to invest in people, real people, not just projects that look good on paper. Carolyn was struck by the sincerity in his voice. It was the kind of vision that many people spoke about in theory, but rarely acted upon in practice. David wasn't just talking about charity or philanthropy in the traditional sense. He was talking about something deeper, about changing the way he connected with others, about focusing on the human side of his success, rather than the corporate one. I believe in you, Carolyn said softly. I think you can do it. And I think in a way, this moment was meant to happen. You needed to share this part of yourself with someone. And now maybe the world needs to hear it too. David's eyes softened, a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability flashing across his face. I've spent so long hiding from the world, from who I am, that I forgot how powerful it can be to simply be yourself. But now that I've started, there's no turning back. He smiled, and for the first time in their conversation, the weight on his shoulders seemed to lift. The burden of his public persona, the struggle of pretending to be someone he wasn't, seemed to fade just a little. Carolyn took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling in. This revelation wasn't just about uncovering a hidden truth about a man in the public eye. It was about understanding the complexities of fame, identity, and the human desire for authenticity. David's journey was only beginning, but it was clear that this was the start of something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. As they sat there in that small cafe, the city outside seemed to slow down, as if the world was giving David the time and space he needed to find himself once again. And in that stillness, Carolyn knew that what had started as an unexpected encounter would lead to something much more profound. The man before her wasn't just a symbol anymore. He was a person who was ready to rediscover himself, and, in the process, inspire others to do the same. And in that moment, Carolyn realized that sometimes, the most extraordinary things happen when we allow ourselves to be honest and vulnerable, to embrace the truth of who we really are. The days that followed Carolyn and David's conversation marked the beginning of a shift, not just for David, but for those around him. It wasn't immediate, nor was it easy, but a quiet transformation had taken root in his heart. The truth he had shared with Carolyn had unlocked something within him, and now, he had to decide how to move forward. It wasn't about ignoring his responsibilities or turning his back on the life he had built. It was about finding balance between his public identity and his private, truer self. David sat in his office late one evening, staring out the large glass window that overlooked the city below. The lights twinkled like stars, and the hum of life outside seemed to reflect the constant rush of thoughts running through his mind. It was during moments like this that he often felt disconnected from the world around him, as if he were looking at it through a glass. But today was different. Today there was clarity. He could no longer deny that he wanted something deeper, something more. It wasn't just about technology, business ventures, or global accolades anymore. It was about people. It was about connection. About finding a way to use his influence, not for personal gain, but to make a genuine impact. He'd been so focused on changing the world through his companies and innovations, but now he wanted to change the world in a way that felt more personal, more meaningful. David picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years, the number of his childhood mentor, someone who had taught him not just about business, but about life. "Hello." The voice on the other end was familiar, a bit older but still full of energy. "Hey, it's David," he said, his voice steady. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately, and I think I need your advice." The mentor on the other end paused for a moment. "What's going on, David?" David took a deep breath, knowing this conversation was a turning point. "I think I've lost my way. I've been so caught up in this image of who I'm supposed to be, that I've forgotten who I am, and I think it's time for me to find my real purpose, to stop running after success and start focusing on what truly matters." The mentor's voice softened, a knowing warmth in his tone. "That's a big realization, David. But it's never too late to change direction. It might take time, but the most important thing is that you've recognized this shift. Now it's about what you do next." David smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "I don't know exactly what it looks like yet, but I'm ready to figure it out." Over the next few weeks, David threw himself into rethinking his legacy. It wasn't just about the companies he had built, or the projects he had started. It was about what he could contribute to society, what he could give back to the communities and individuals who needed it the most. He started small. He reached out to organizations that focused on education, mental health, and environmental sustainability, areas he had always believed in but never fully explored. He began meeting with leaders in these fields, not as a billionaire investor, but as someone who genuinely wanted to learn, to listen, and to contribute. One day, David found himself in a small community center on the outskirts of a city, listening to a group of young people speak about their struggles. They shared their dreams, their fears, and their aspirations, and David felt a deep sense of connection. These were real people, with real challenges, people who weren't interested in his wealth or his fame. They wanted someone to believe in them. As he walked away from that meeting, David realized something profound. He wasn't just meant to be a spectator in this world. He was meant to engage. His resources, his time, his knowledge, he could use all of it to help make people's lives better. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He didn't want to be someone's savior, but he could be a catalyst for change. The next few months were filled with meetings, travel, and new ideas. David was no longer hiding behind the veil of his public persona. He was stepping out, not to prove anything to anyone but to follow his own heart. He started a new initiative, one focused on giving back to the very people who had helped him shape his own success. It was called Reignite, a program designed to empower underprivileged communities through access to education, mentorship, and resources. David worked with a diverse group of people, entrepreneurs, educators, social workers, and activists, to create a network that could reach people who needed it the most. He didn't want this to be just another charity. He wanted it to be a movement, one that would shift the focus from what people could get to what they could give. He also spent more time with his family, reconnecting with his roots. He made it a priority to be present for his children, to teach them the values he had once learned in his own youth, values that had gotten lost along the way. As the months went by, the more David immersed himself in this new life, the more he found his sense of purpose. The constant pressure of being Elon Musk, the larger-than-life figure, slowly faded. It didn't matter anymore if people knew his name or admired his accomplishments. What mattered was the work he was doing now, the lives he was touching, the people he was helping, and the genuine connections he was building. And through all of this, Carolyn remained by his side, supporting him in his journey of rediscovery. They continued to meet, to talk, and to share their thoughts. She had been there from the beginning, a quiet but steadfast presence in his life, offering wisdom and understanding when he needed it most. David had once been a man lost in the labyrinth of fame and expectation, but now he was finding his way out. He was no longer bound by the pressures of the world's view of him. He had stepped into his true identity, one that wasn't defined by others, but by the impact he had on those around him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, David felt like he was walking it with purpose. And that, more than anything, was enough. In the end, David had discovered something far more valuable than fame or wealth: the power to change the world, one small act of kindness at a time, and that was a legacy worth building. As David's journey of rediscovery continued, the changes within him began to spread outward, creating a ripple effect that reached far beyond his immediate circle. People started to notice the shift in his attitude, both in his professional endeavors and in his personal life. The CEO, who once thrived on competition and power, was now someone who focused on collaboration and compassion. His old colleagues, business partners, and even rivals couldn't ignore the transformation. Some were skeptical at first, unsure if this was just a phase or a calculated public relations move. But as months passed, it became clear that this was something more profound. David was no longer the same person. At Reignite, the new initiative he had launched, there was a palpable sense of energy. Volunteers and community leaders, some of whom had never imagined working alongside someone like David, were inspired by his genuine desire to give back. It wasn't about making a profit or increasing his personal influence. It was about seeing real change, real progress. Together they worked tirelessly to create scholarships, job training programs, and mentorship opportunities for underprivileged youth. David wasn't just showing up for photo ops, he was actively involved, meeting with local leaders, listening to stories, and offering his resources in any way he could. One particular partnership stood out. David had partnered with a small nonprofit that focused on mental health services for low-income families. The organization had been struggling to keep up with demand, and David's investment allowed them to expand their operations. But what really struck people was his commitment to the cause. Rather than just providing financial support, he personally attended their mental health workshops, helping destigmatize therapy and offering insights into how individuals could find peace and healing in their lives. The mental health initiative became one of the most successful programs under Reignite, with more and more people seeking help, finding comfort, and being empowered to change their own lives. People who had been silently suffering for years finally had access to resources they never knew existed. David's hands-on approach to this initiative opened the doors for others, people who never imagined that a figure of his stature could truly care. But David's shift wasn't just felt in the business world or in the nonprofit sector. It was in his relationships too. His family, especially his children, saw the man they had always admired in a new light. No longer was he just the father who provided, the provider who worked endless hours to secure their future. He was a father who was present, emotionally available, and deeply involved in their lives. David's daughter, Lily, had been struggling with her own sense of identity, feeling like she couldn't live up to the expectations placed on her. She had been silently battling anxiety and self-doubt, despite being surrounded by wealth and privilege. But as she watched her father change, she began to open up. She came to him one evening, after dinner, and for the first time, told him about the pressure she felt. "I feel like I'm constantly trying to be something I'm not," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Like I'm supposed to live up to this image of perfection, but I don't know who I am anymore." David listened without interrupting. He understood. He had been there, trapped in his own expectations. When she finished, he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be anyone other than yourself, Lily. You're enough, just as you are. You're not defined by what others expect of you. You're defined by what you believe in, what you love, and who you choose to become." Lily's eyes welled up with tears. She had never heard him speak to her like this before. It was as if the walls that had once kept them from truly connecting had suddenly fallen away. That night, their relationship deepened, and Lily began to make strides in overcoming her anxiety, embracing her authentic self. David's change also impacted his team at SpaceX and Tesla. Employees who had long admired him for his innovative ideas and sharp mind now began to see him as a leader who genuinely cared about their well-being. His new approach to leadership was about empathy, trust, and empowerment. He made it clear that success was no longer just measured by the bottom line, but by the impact they had on the lives of others. One of the engineers at Tesla, Marcus, had been with the company for years. He had always felt that his work, though important, lacked personal fulfillment. But when David began speaking about purpose and giving back, Marcus felt inspired to take action. He helped develop a new initiative within the company that focused on creating sustainable energy solutions for underprivileged communities. It wasn't just about reducing carbon footprints, it was about making a real, tangible difference in the lives of those who had been overlooked by larger corporations. The ripple effect of David's transformation extended to the media as well. Once a controversial figure, he began to be seen in a different light. Journalists who had once been skeptical of his intentions began to report on his philanthropic work with a sense of admiration. The public, too, began to see him as more than just a tech mogul. He was a father, a mentor, a leader who was using his power and influence to change the world. It wasn't a perfect narrative, and David wasn't interested in trying to make it one. He knew that real change took time and effort, and that some people would never see his journey for what it truly was. But he was okay with that. The only thing that mattered now was the impact he was having. Day by day, one life at a time. By the end of the year, Reignite had expanded its reach beyond the local communities it initially served. It had become a national movement, with hundreds of partners and volunteers working together to build a brighter future for those in need. The program's success wasn't just measured by the number of people it helped, but by the lives it had transformed, including David's own. David had come full circle. The man who had once been lost in the pursuit of fame and fortune had found something far more meaningful, a purpose that transcended his own ambitions. He had discovered that true success was not about what you could accumulate, but about what you could give back, and in that, he had found peace. The ripple effect of his change continued to spread, touching lives in ways he could have never imagined. As he stood before a crowd at the opening of a new Reignite Center, he reflected on the path that had brought him here, the path of self-discovery, of vulnerability, and of redemption. "You don't have to change the world in one big moment," he said to the audience, his voice steady and sincere. "You change it in the small moments, through the connections you make, the people you uplift, and the love you give." And with that, David smiled, knowing that his true legacy had only just begun. Despite all the progress David had made, he faced one final test, a challenge that would put everything he had learned to the ultimate trial. It came when the CEO of a major global corporation, Jameson Corp., approached him with an opportunity to merge their companies. Jameson was a known figure in the business world, a man who had built his empire through ruthless strategies and aggressive acquisitions. The offer seemed like a dream come true for SpaceX and Tesla, a chance to dominate the market like never before. The deal promised vast wealth, exponential growth, and more influence than David had ever imagined. But as David sat across from Jameson in a sleek conference room, he could feel a familiar temptation stirring within him. The very same temptation that had led him astray years ago, the desire for more. The allure of power, the thrill of expanding his empire, and the validation that came from being the top of the food chain. Jameson, with his sharp suit and cold smile, didn't seem like someone who cared about people or the planet. He cared about results, profits, and winning at all costs. David found himself torn. On one hand, the deal could revolutionize the future of clean energy, providing the resources to make a global impact. On the other, it was clear that Jameson had no interest in the ethical practices David had come to value so much. The merger could potentially compromise the very values he had fought so hard to instill in his companies. For the first time since his transformation, David felt a deep internal conflict. Was it worth sacrificing his principles for the sake of growth? Could he continue to make a difference in the world while working with someone like Jameson? Or had his journey of redemption simply been a temporary phase, one that would be tested by the very forces he had once embraced? As he sat there, the room felt suffocating. His mind raced with thoughts of the future SpaceX becoming a global powerhouse, Tesla expanding its reach to every corner of the globe. It was the kind of opportunity that most CEOs would jump at, the kind of opportunity that could cement his legacy as one of the most influential figures in the world. But in the back of his mind, David heard the voices of the people he had met through Reignite. He remembered the faces of the young people he had mentored, the families whose lives had been changed by the mental health programs, the communities that had benefited from sustainable energy solutions. Those were the faces that mattered. Those were the people who were counting on him to stay true to his word. David took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He thought about his children, his wife, and the legacy he wanted to leave behind. Was it worth building an empire at the cost of his integrity? Was it worth compromising the values he had fought so hard to reclaim? "You want me to sign this contract today?" David said, his voice steady. "But I need to think about it. I need to think about what kind of future I want to create, not just for me, but for everyone who depends on us." Jameson's smile faltered. "You don't need to think about it, David. This is the deal of a lifetime. Don't let your emotions get in the way of business." David stood up slowly, his mind made up. Business without heart isn't business at all. And this deal, it doesn't align with the future I want to build. "I'm sorry, Jameson, but I'm going to have to decline." Jameson's eyes narrowed, but David didn't flinch. He had made his choice. The old David, the one driven by ego and the hunger for more, would have jumped at the chance to make this deal happen. But the new David, the one who understood that true success was measured by the impact you had on the world, had just made the hardest decision of his life. The following weeks were filled with media backlash and pressure from investors. Many questioned his decision, calling it short-sighted and naive. How could David pass up such a massive opportunity? Why would he choose to walk away from a deal that could guarantee unprecedented success? The business world, always hungry for growth, didn't understand. But as the dust settled, David felt a sense of peace. He had chosen the path that felt right to him, the path of purpose and integrity. SpaceX and Tesla continued to thrive, albeit at a slower pace than they could have under the merger, but they remained true to their mission. David's decision to stay aligned with his values inspired others in the industry to question their own motives. Slowly but surely, more leaders began to prioritize ethical business practices, understanding that profits could coexist with compassion. David's relationship with his family deepened even further. His children, especially Lily, saw his actions not as a rejection of ambition, but as an affirmation of his true character. They understood that success wasn't just about what you built, it was about how you built it and who you built it for. Over time, the companies David had founded became symbols of responsible growth. SpaceX focused on exploring space while protecting the Earth, while Tesla pioneered new technologies that prioritized sustainability over profit. And Reignite expanded its reach, touching lives across the globe, continuing to be a beacon of hope and inspiration for people who needed it the most. David's final test had been passed, not because he made the easy choice, but because he chose the right one. His legacy was no longer just about the companies he had built, but about the lives he had touched, the hearts he had changed, and the example he had set for others to follow. The true measure of success, he realized, was never in the size of your empire, but in the goodness you created in the world. As he stood on the balcony of his home one evening, looking out at the horizon, David knew that his journey was far from over. The world was still full of challenges, but he was ready to face them, knowing that the choices he made would always be guided by the values that mattered most. And in that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the lessons he had learned, the people he had met, and the life he was living. True fulfillment, David had discovered, was never about what you gained, it was about what you gave. And that, above all, was the legacy he would leave behind. Years had passed since David's monumental decision to turn down the merger with Jameson Corp., and his journey of transformation had evolved in ways he never anticipated. SpaceX and Tesla continued to thrive, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just tech companies, they had become symbols of integrity, innovation, and the potential for business to be a force for good. David had spent the past few years focusing on expanding Reignite's mission, helping young entrepreneurs, educators, and community leaders who shared his vision of creating a better, more sustainable world. He traveled far and wide, speaking at conferences, visiting universities, and meeting with people who shared his passion for changing the world. He realized that the true power of Reignite wasn't just in the resources it provided, but in the network of like-minded individuals it fostered. It became a movement, one that spanned borders and connected people across continents, who were committed to solving some of the world's most pressing issues. David's influence as a leader had grown not just because of his business acumen, but because of his authentic commitment to the values he espoused. More and more businesses began to shift towards sustainable practices, not just because it was profitable, but because it was the right thing to do. David had helped pave the way for a new generation of business leaders who believed that success was measured by the impact you made on the world, not just the profits you earned. One of the most significant developments in David's life came when he received an unexpected phone call from a world leader, a president of a small island nation that had been struggling with climate change, economic instability, and political unrest. The president had heard of David's work and asked him to help lead an initiative to revitalize the country, to help it transition to clean energy and sustainable development. The offer was not only an incredible opportunity to make a global impact, but also a personal challenge that would test every principle David had fought for. He knew it would be a difficult task. There were many entrenched political and economic forces to deal with, and the country had been through so many hardships that trust in outsiders was minimal. But David's heart told him this was the challenge he had been waiting for, the next step in his journey. David flew to the island with a small team of trusted advisors and experts. Upon arriving, he was immediately struck by the contrast between the island's stunning natural beauty and the visible signs of environmental degradation and poverty. The streets were lined with dilapidated buildings, the oceans were filled with plastic waste, and the people seemed worn down by years of hardship. It was a community in need of hope, and David knew he had to bring more than just business solutions. He had to bring faith. His first few meetings with the leaders of the country were tense. There was a natural skepticism about his motives, given his background as a wealthy entrepreneur and outsider. But David was determined to earn their trust, and he spent the next few weeks traveling to remote villages, meeting with farmers, teachers, and workers. He listened to their stories, understood their struggles, and began to weave together a plan that was not only environmentally sustainable, but also deeply rooted in the community's own strengths. David didn't offer quick fixes or empty promises. He didn't come in as a savior, but as a collaborator, someone who genuinely wanted to learn from the people and understand what would work for them. Over time, the people began to see him not as an outsider, but as someone who truly cared about their future. His humility, transparency, and authenticity won them over. As the project began to take shape, David's approach was holistic. He didn't just focus on renewable energy and clean technology. He also emphasized education, healthcare, and social entrepreneurship. By empowering the people with knowledge and resources, he was helping them build their own future. It was a model of sustainable development that prioritized both environmental and human well-being, and it began to show results. Schools were rebuilt, communities started new businesses focused on clean technologies, and a renewable energy infrastructure began to take root. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. The project faced setbacks from global political pressures, local corruption, and environmental disasters. There were moments when it seemed like the entire initiative might collapse. David's resolve was tested in ways he had never imagined. But through it all, he remembered the lessons he had learned in his earlier years, the importance of resilience, the power of community, and the unwavering belief that positive change, while difficult, was always worth fighting for. Then, one night, after months of hard work, David stood on a small hill overlooking the village where it had all started. The sun was setting, casting a golden light across the landscape, and he could see the lights of the new solar panels flickering on in the distance, illuminating the homes of the people who had once struggled in the dark. It was in that moment that David realized how far he had come. The journey was never about the wealth or the power, it was always about finding purpose, about creating something that would outlast him, something that would make the world a better place for future generations. His decisions, the ones that had once seemed so difficult, had led him here, to this very moment. As he stood there, surrounded by the sounds of the village coming to life, David felt a profound sense of peace. The world still had its challenges, but he had found his place in it. It wasn't about avoiding hardship or running from failure, it was about standing firm in the face of adversity and continuing to push for a better tomorrow. David knew that his journey wasn't over. It never would be. But as he looked out at the horizon, he saw a future filled with possibility. He had discovered the greatest truth of all, that change, no matter how slow or difficult, was always possible. And it was the quiet, persistent efforts of people working together for the greater good that could truly change the world. And as the stars began to appear in the night sky, David smiled. He had come full circle. As the years passed, David's efforts in transforming the island nation continued to flourish. The initiative he had pioneered there became a model for other countries grappling with similar challenges: climate change, poverty, and political instability. More and more world leaders reached out to him, asking for guidance on how they too could make their countries more sustainable, equitable, and prosperous. David, however, remained grounded. He never let the attention or accolades get to him. His primary focus was always on the people: the farmers, the teachers, the children, and the communities that had placed their trust in him. He continued to visit the island frequently, seeing firsthand how the transformation had begun to ripple across the nation, touching every life. One of the proudest moments of his journey came when a group of young entrepreneurs from the island presented him with an award. These entrepreneurs had started their own clean energy companies, modeled after the principles of Reignite that David had introduced. They were now creating jobs, improving infrastructure, and exporting technology to other countries. The smiles on their faces, the hope in their eyes, told David everything he needed to know. His work was no longer just about change, it was about empowerment. He had helped plant the seeds of a movement, and now the next generation was cultivating them. David realized that his impact had extended far beyond the business world. He had started with technology, but now he saw how the core values of sustainable development, ethical leadership, and community empowerment had transformed countless lives. It wasn't just about creating profits anymore, it was about building a legacy. In the years that followed, Reignite grew into a global organization. It became a hub for young, driven individuals who wanted to make a difference. With its emphasis on education, mentorship, and grassroots innovation, it attracted talent from all over the world. Whether it was young women in Africa working on water purification technology, or rural farmers in Southeast Asia learning to use solar-powered irrigation systems, Reignite had touched lives everywhere. David had intentionally created a platform where anyone, regardless of their background, could contribute to the cause of sustainability. This inclusiveness was one of the cornerstones of Reignite's success. People from different walks of life, cultures, and experiences came together under one shared mission: to create a better world for future generations. David's belief in the power of diversity and inclusion had helped foster a thriving, global network of changemakers. It wasn't just the success of Reignite that kept David going, it was the way people had adopted and adapted his principles to their own lives. There were local leaders now in communities across the world who used David's teachings to start their own social enterprises. There were countless individuals who, inspired by his vision, had turned their lives around, pursuing careers that not only supported their families but also contributed to the larger mission of environmental and social justice. David was often asked what motivated him to keep pushing, even when the path was uncertain or the obstacles seemed insurmountable. His answer was always simple: I didn't do this alone. Every person I met, every community I worked with, every success and failure along the way has shaped me into who I am today. The real power comes from collaboration. We are all part of the same journey. If we don't all succeed, none of us do. By now, David's influence had reached a point where his words carried weight, and his actions had become a blueprint for others. He became a sought-after speaker at global summits and conferences, but he never lost sight of the heart of his mission: to help people live better, more sustainable lives. One of his most impactful speeches came during a United Nations climate summit, where he was invited to address world leaders. It was a pivotal moment. The world was at a crossroads, and the choices made in that room could determine the future of the planet. David stood before them, not as a businessman or billionaire, but as a leader who had dedicated his life to creating sustainable solutions. He spoke about the importance of collaborative action, the need to include marginalized voices in the conversation, and the urgency of acting now, not tomorrow, not next year. He didn't sugarcoat the challenges, nor did he promise easy solutions. He talked about the harsh realities, but he also talked about the incredible potential for transformation. He reminded the leaders in the room that history would remember them, not for the deals they brokered, or the wealth they accumulated, but for the impact they left on the world. The choices they made now would determine whether future generations would have the opportunity to live in a world that was capable of sustaining life. David's words resonated with many that day, and his message sparked a renewed sense of urgency in the global community. It wasn't the world's leaders alone who needed to act, it was every individual, every business, every community. Change would only happen when people at all levels began to work together for the common good. As David grew older, he began to reflect more deeply on his legacy. He had achieved more than he had ever dreamed possible, but he didn't see his work as finished. There were still challenges to face, still battles to fight, and still opportunities to make a difference. His focus shifted from achieving personal success to ensuring that the work he had started would continue long after he was gone. He began to establish initiatives that would outlast his lifetime: scholarships, global partnerships, and programs aimed at developing the next generation of leaders in sustainable business and environmental justice. He worked with young people to help them develop the skills and knowledge they would need to continue the work of building a sustainable, equitable world. David's impact was more than just the companies he had built or the projects he had led. It was in the millions of lives he had touched, the communities he had helped uplift, and the values he had instilled in those around him. It wasn't about creating wealth, it was about creating change that would endure. As David sat on the porch of his home one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he knew that his life had come full circle. He had found his true purpose, and through every trial and triumph, he had stayed true to the values that mattered most. His legacy was no longer just about the technology or the businesses, it was about the world that he had helped shape, a world that was more sustainable, and filled with hope for future generations. David's story would continue, not in the stories told about him, but in the lives of the people who had been inspired by his work. The change he had ignited would live on, as would the vision that had driven him, a better, more sustainable world for all. As David's journey continued, he recognized that the time had come to pass on the leadership of Reignite. After years of spearheading global initiatives, he knew that in order for the movement to truly endure, it needed fresh perspectives, new energy, and the innovation of a younger generation. It was no longer just about his vision, it was about ensuring the continuity of the mission and empowering others to carry the torch forward. David had always believed that leadership was not about holding on to power but about empowering others to step into their own greatness. This was a principle he had lived by since the beginning of his journey, and now it was more important than ever. He began preparing the next generation of leaders, making it a priority to mentor young people who shared his passion for sustainability and social justice. He started a new initiative within Reignite, called the Torchbearers Program, aimed at nurturing young talent and giving them the tools they needed to make their own impact. Through this program, David worked closely with a diverse group of emerging leaders from around the world, teaching them everything he had learned about sustainable business, ethical leadership, and the power of collaboration. He instilled in them the importance of not only thinking about the present but also creating solutions for the future. David's mentees came from every corner of the globe, from Africa to South America, from Asia to Europe. Many were young women, who had long been underrepresented in the sustainability sector. David had always been a champion for gender equality, and he wanted to ensure that future leaders would reflect the diversity and richness of the world they were working to transform. One of his brightest mentees, Maya, a young woman from a small village in India, was quickly becoming one of Reignite's most influential voices. Maya had come to David's attention through a project she had started in her village, where she was using sustainable farming techniques to help local farmers increase their yields while protecting the environment. David saw in her the same fire that had driven him at the beginning of his journey. He knew she had the potential to lead the next phase of Reignite's growth. Maya was grateful for David's mentorship, but she also knew that the movement needed more than just one voice. It needed a community of leaders, all committed to the same vision. Together, they worked on expanding the Torchbearers program, bringing in even more young leaders who were passionate about making a difference. David watched with pride as the young leaders took on more responsibility, leading projects in their own communities and making decisions that aligned with the values he had instilled in them. He no longer felt the weight of leadership on his shoulders alone. He had created a network of leaders who were just as committed to the mission as he had been. In his heart, he knew that Reignite was now a global movement that could continue without him at the helm. One day, during a meeting with the senior leadership team, David made an announcement that would change everything. He was stepping down as CEO of Reignite. "It's time for the next chapter," David said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've had the privilege of leading this organization and I'm proud of everything we've achieved. But the world is changing, and the future belongs to you all. You've worked hard to get here, and now it's your turn to lead." There was a moment of silence in the room, as everyone processed what David had said. They had all known this day was coming, but the realization of it hit hard. David was more than just a leader to them. He was a mentor, a guide, and a source of inspiration. His departure marked the end of an era for Reignite, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in the organization's history. Maya, now one of the rising stars in the organization, was selected to take over as CEO. Though she had big shoes to fill, she was ready. Under David's guidance, she had learned not just the technical aspects of leadership but also the deeper values of humility, service and compassion that would guide her as she led Reignite into the future. David's decision to step down was not a retreat, it was a celebration of the legacy he had built. He knew that the work was far from finished, but he also understood that sometimes the best way to move forward was to step back and allow others to take the lead. In his final days as CEO, David continued to travel, speak, and mentor, but his focus shifted. He began to spend more time reflecting on the deeper questions of life, on what it meant to have truly made a difference, on how to ensure that the work he had started would continue to grow and evolve. He looked at the young leaders now at the helm of Reignite and knew that the future was in good hands. In one of his final speeches as CEO, David shared a story that had stuck with him throughout his journey. "When I first started out, I was just a young man with an idea. I didn't have all the answers, but I had a vision of a world where we could come together to create something better. And over the years, I've learned something important. Change doesn't happen because of one person, no matter how passionate or driven they are. Change happens when many people, with different skills, different perspectives, and different backgrounds, come together to make a difference. It's the collective effort that drives progress." David's message was clear. Leadership was not about power or control, it was about the strength of collaboration, the power of a shared vision, and the ability to inspire others to join in the movement. As the sun set on David's time at the helm of Reignite, he knew that his work had only just begun. He had laid the foundation for a legacy that would continue for generations to come, and with the next generation of leaders taking charge, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the torch had been passed. David's departure from Reignite marked the end of an era, but his legacy was far from over. Even as he stepped back from the spotlight, the impact of his work continued to reverberate across the globe. The values of sustainability, social justice, and collective action that he had championed remained at the heart of the organization's mission. The transition to new leadership was a seamless one. Maya, as the new CEO, took on her role with the same passion and vision that David had instilled in her. She wasn't just carrying on David's work, she was building on it, taking it in new directions, and pushing the boundaries of what Reignite could achieve. Under Maya's leadership, Reignite expanded its reach, partnering with governments, international organizations, and local communities to launch ambitious projects aimed at combating climate change, promoting economic equity, and ensuring access to education and healthcare for underserved populations. The organization's network of torchbearers grew exponentially, with thousands of young leaders now carrying the flame of sustainability and justice in their communities. One of the most significant projects under Maya's leadership was the Global Green Cities Initiative, a vision that David had begun to form before stepping down. The initiative aimed to transform urban centers around the world into models of sustainable living, focusing on green architecture, clean energy, and urban agriculture. It was a long-term vision, one that David had always dreamed of but never saw fully realized in his lifetime. Now, with Maya at the helm, the project gained traction, and cities from New York to Nairobi began implementing innovative, sustainable solutions. But it wasn't just the large-scale initiatives that carried David's legacy forward. It was also the everyday actions of people who had been inspired by his words and his work. All around the world, individuals were making small changes that collectively made a huge difference. Farmers were using organic methods to grow their crops. Entrepreneurs were launching businesses that prioritized environmental responsibility. Activists were organizing protests, raising awareness, and holding governments accountable for their environmental and social policies. David often received letters and messages from people around the world, ordinary individuals who had been inspired by his story and his vision. Many of them had joined Reignite in some capacity, and others had started their own initiatives, following the example of sustainability and justice that David had set. These stories were a testament to the power of one individual's commitment to change. David had shown the world that it wasn't about waiting for others to act, it was about taking action yourself, no matter how small, and trusting that it would ripple out to create a broader impact. In the years following his resignation, David remained active as a mentor and advisor, though he was no longer leading Reignite directly. He traveled the world to meet with the young leaders he had mentored, offering guidance and wisdom as they navigated the challenges of leading global initiatives. One of his proudest moments was watching Maya and others like her step into positions of power and influence. He had always believed that true leadership was about lifting others up, and in these moments, he saw his own philosophy come to life. David also continued his personal efforts to live a life of integrity, aligning his actions with the values he had fought for. He became even more involved in local community work, focusing on supporting marginalized groups and encouraging dialogue about the intersection of environmental issues and social justice. His work was no longer confined to boardrooms and global summits. He was in the trenches, alongside the very people he had aimed to serve, ensuring that the movements he had helped build would continue to thrive. But it wasn't just the practical impact of his work that mattered to David. It was the deeper, more profound change, the way he had inspired people to think differently about the world and their place in it. He had ignited a spark in countless individuals who now saw themselves as part of something larger than themselves, working toward a shared vision of a more just and sustainable world. As David grew older, he found himself reflecting more on the legacy he would leave behind. He thought about his children, his mentees, and the many people whose lives had been touched by his work. He had lived a life of purpose, one driven by a vision of a better world. He had poured his heart and soul into Reignite, and he had seen it grow into a global movement. In his final years, David found peace knowing that Reignite had not only survived his departure but had flourished. He had created a system where leadership was decentralized, where the work was driven by a network of passionate individuals all over the world. He had built something that would outlast him, something that would continue to evolve and grow in ways he had never imagined. David passed away quietly in his sleep, surrounded by family, friends, and the young leaders who had once looked up to him. His death was not the end of his legacy, it was merely a new chapter in the ongoing story of Reignite. The organization continued to thrive, and the values he had championed remained at the core of every project, every initiative, and every leader who carried on his work. As the world mourned his passing, it also celebrated his life, the life of a man who had dared to dream big, who had fought for justice, and who had inspired a generation to do the same. David's legacy lived on in every action taken to protect the planet, in every fight for equality, and in every step toward a more sustainable future. David had built something enduring, a movement, a community, and a vision that would continue to inspire people for generations to come. His legacy was not just about what he had achieved, but about the lives he had touched and the change he had sparked. It was a legacy that would live on, forever igniting the hearts and minds of those who believed in a better world. David's passing had left a deep void, but the movement he started, Reignite, was no longer just a singular vision, it was a global force. Over the years, the network of leaders, activists, and change-makers he had inspired continued to expand, creating an ever-growing web of individuals united by a shared sense of purpose. His death marked not the end, but rather the continuation of a legacy that would now take on a life of its own, propelled by the very people who had been touched by his words, actions, and philosophy. As the years went by, the global impact of Reignite became undeniable. What had begun as a modest grassroots effort had transformed into an unstoppable movement, with millions of individuals worldwide committed to fighting for the causes that David had cared about. Environmental sustainability, social justice, equitable education, and community empowerment became the pillars of the movement, values that David had long believed in and worked to elevate. Under Maya's leadership, Reignite had strengthened its influence, establishing partnerships with global organizations, governments, and businesses. It wasn't just a non-profit anymore, it was a coalition of people across all sectors of society, united in the fight for a better world. Major corporations, recognizing the growing power of the movement, had restructured their business models to align with Reignite's principles, implementing sustainable practices and prioritizing the welfare of communities. The Global Green Cities Initiative, which David had envisioned as his final masterpiece, had grown into one of the most ambitious urban transformation projects in the world. Cities like Copenhagen, Tokyo, and Sao Paulo had become hubs of sustainable living, leading the way in green architecture, waste reduction, and renewable energy. In the poorest parts of the world, Reignite's urban development programs had helped build self-sustaining communities with clean water, renewable energy sources, and access to healthy food. The initiative had proven that no matter how developed or underdeveloped a region was, the dream of sustainable cities could be realized. David's vision for Reignite was always rooted in the idea that change must be both global and local, that every individual had a role to play, no matter where they came from or how small their actions seemed. Over time, this principle had been embraced by millions around the world. In every corner of the globe, there were communities taking action, empowered by the tools, knowledge, and support Reignite had provided them. People in rural villages in Africa had started growing organic crops to combat hunger and climate change, while urban youth in the United States were leading climate strikes and advocating for policy reform. The movement was no longer just about sustainability, it had become about human dignity, about ensuring that everyone, regardless of race, gender, or income, had access to the resources they needed to thrive. One of the most remarkable stories was that of a small village in the Philippines. Years before, this community had been struggling with poverty and the effects of environmental degradation. But thanks to the work of Reignite and the efforts of local activists, the village had transformed into a model of sustainability. Solar panels now powered homes, and rainwater harvesting systems provided clean water for all. The village had even built its own organic farm, creating jobs and fostering a sense of community. What had started as a small seed of hope had blossomed into a thriving, self-sustaining community that was now being showcased as an example for other rural areas around the world. Reignite's Torchbearer program had played a pivotal role in this global shift. By empowering young people with the tools, resources, and networks to make change in their communities, the organization had cultivated a new generation of leaders who were committed to tackling the world's most pressing issues. These torchbearers were not only activists, they were entrepreneurs, scientists, educators, and policymakers, people who were not afraid to challenge the status quo and create the kind of world David had always dreamed of. The success of Reignite was also reflected in the growing number of policy changes that were being made worldwide. Governments had begun to listen, realizing that they could no longer ignore the demands of the people. From Paris to Buenos Aires, leaders were signing agreements to implement bold climate action plans, increase access to education, and fight racial inequality. While there was still much work to be done, the momentum was undeniable. And then there were the stories. Countless individuals, families, and communities had shared their journeys with Reignite. The organization had become a platform for voices that had long been ignored, the stories of people who had struggled against injustice, environmental destruction, and systemic inequality. Through storytelling, Reignite had given a voice to the marginalized, empowering them to speak their truth and inspire others to take action. One story in particular stood out: a young woman from a remote village in India who had been forced into child marriage but had defied the odds. She had found refuge in a Reignite community program, which not only provided her with an education, but also helped her build a sustainable business that supported her family. Her journey of resilience and empowerment had become a symbol of what was possible when people were given the opportunity to change their own lives. David had always believed in the power of storytelling. He knew that true change could not be achieved through statistics and facts alone. It had to be driven by the personal stories of those affected. Reignite's success was built on the countless stories of people who had overcome adversity, found their voices, and transformed their communities. These stories continued to inspire and motivate the next generation of leaders, ensuring that David's legacy lived on in every story told, every life changed, and every step forward taken toward a more just and sustainable world. As the movement continued to grow, it became clear that Reignite was no longer just a campaign, it was a global revolution, one that would continue to unfold for generations. The seeds David had planted had blossomed into a powerful global community of changemakers who were united by a common vision, and though David was no longer there to witness it firsthand, his impact was everywhere, woven into the very fabric of the movement he had created. His legacy had transcended time, geography, and circumstance, continuing to inspire the world to fight for a future that was just, sustainable, and full of hope. In the end, David had achieved the impossible. He had ignited a flame that could never be extinguished, a movement that would burn bright for as long as humanity fought for a better world.